Racism. Whose problem is it? Do you know the names of everyone who lives in your street? We absolutely should be intentional about loving the people who live next door or across the road. And yet Jesus makes it clear that neighbor means so much more than those with whom we share a suburb or a block of flats, and our responsibility is so much more than just to smile and wave. The root of racism is failing to see God's image in people who don't look like us. Perhaps you're thinking, sure, but what does this have to do with me? When people asked Jesus about the greatest commandment ever, he answered with two commandments: love God and love your neighbor, Matthew 22:34-40. These two commandments are intrinsically linked. We can't love God without loving people too. And when someone asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" he answered by telling the story of the Good Samaritan, Luke 10:30-37. This story would have shocked Jesus' Jewish audience because there was a long history of hostility between Jews and Samaritans. Maybe you've felt shocked by forced proximity with someone from another race, culture, or socioeconomic bracket. Perhaps you know all about historical racial hostility. Perhaps there are people you tend to avoid, consciously or unconsciously. What's God saying to you about your reactions? What's your next step? In Jesus' parable, the person who looked least like a neighbor was the one who acted most like one. Jesus makes the point that in God's kingdom, there are no racial, ethnic, or cultural divisions. The Samaritan wasn't from the same area as the injured Jewish man lying on the road. He didn't know him or live next to him. The Samaritan demonstrated that neighbors transcend barriers. Being a good neighbor is easy when we're dealing with people we like, people who are similar to us, or even just people we know. But in Jesus' definition of neighbor, similarity, familiarity, and fondness aren't factors. We get to model Jesus' command to love God and love others within our church communities. In 1 Corinthians 12:25-27, Paul explains how God has created his global church, the body of Christ. There should be no division in the body, but its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. Imagine what would change if everyone in your community or circle of friends started saying, "Racism is my problem too." Jesus himself modeled how to cross barriers and love people who were different. He left heaven to eat with tax collectors, befriend fishermen, speak to lepers and show grace to sinners. Take some time to let the sobering truth sink in that racism is our problem too, and it's a problem we can solve by obeying Jesus' commands to love God and love people. Let's embrace every opportunity to show up in the lives of all sorts of neighbors, with grace, love, and respect.
Jesus replied with a story. A Jewish man was traveling on a trip from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along. But when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn, where he took care of him. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, "Take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here." Now, which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? Jesus asked. The man replied,
"The one who showed him mercy."
Then Jesus said, "Yes, now go and do the same." Jesus replied, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important: love your neighbor as yourself."